Hey, what's up? It's Bon. Let's talk about Mass Effect, specifically an interview with Mac Walters. Before then, if you like Mass Effect, if you like video games, if you like gaming, news, speculation, and reviews, please subscribe to the channel. Like this video if you do, and leave a comment down below. I'll have some stuff that I'm sure you'll want to comment on. Let's talk about it. Moving into the video, let's set the premise here. This video is going to be based around an article on Eurogamer by Robert Purchase, I believe, with Mac Walters. Mac Walters is a former writer and director at BioWare. He recently, I believe late last year or early this year, left BioWare after being like one of the OGs with Casey Hudson and a bunch of other people. Mac has worked on, I believe, all of the Mass Effect games, as well as some of the Dragon Age games. The last game he worked on technically was Dreadwolf before he left as like a, it sounds like he was more doing like technical advising and not really working on the story. But his last big project, I would say, was the Legendary Edition. He was the creative director or whatever the top position was for that project. So I'm going to pull up the article here and we'll hit some of it. So I'll just be honest. I'm only going to cover basically the second half of the interview. The first half of it was mostly just talking about the inception of Mass Effect and the original trilogy and all of that. I think a lot of what I read felt like it had been covered before, and I don't think I really need to do that again. What I want to focus on is basically everything that could even a little bit have to do with the next game and what comes next. It will it will involve a lot of Andromeda talk, because I do think that what happened with Andromeda matters for the next game a lot, as well as a little bit of talk directly about the next game. So let's just jump right into it. So starting off, the part of the article here is talking about how they did a trilogy and all of the trials and tribulations they had of, like, obviously the first game was fairly simple. They just made a game with a bunch of choices in it. But then as they made 2 and 3, it became a lot more difficult because they had to try to respect and consider all of those choices that you could make in the previous games. So the interviewer kind of talks about it here and says, like, it begs the question to come back to where I began. They had mentioned it earlier in the article of why BioWare hasn't done something like the trilogy Mass Effect again. It certainly drew attention to the series, and I'm convinced that it would do the same for any new BioWare, new game BioWare made now. But no, apparently it never came up. This is a quote from Mac Walters. I don't think we've ever talked about that again, speaking of making a trilogy. And the why of it seems to be simply because we've done that. What else can we do? Now, I kind of take that at like face value to a point. Earlier in the article, it's basically stated that making that trilogy was extremely hard, and that by the time they were making 3, it was even more difficult. And that makes sense. That checks out, right? They obviously, when we see that, 3 is a fairly cut down experience, it maybe doesn't seem like they did everything they probably wanted to do with it. We have the controversial endings, which is a whole different story. I understand why, after the experience of doing one trilogy, why they may not want to do another one. But it is kind of, it's a little bit like turn your head to the side inducing when you say, like, what else can we do, when everything they've done since then has been like kind of rough. Even Inquisition is like fine, and it got a lot of accolades when it came out. I don't think it's aged very well. And then you had Andromeda and then Anthem come out. And I guess to me, I think it's interesting that instead of looking at it like, okay, we've learned a lot of lessons from this experience, let's do it again, but let's take all those lessons into account, especially from the beginning. So say they were to make a new trilogy of games, you would set up the first game to more easily become a second and third game that would ultimately, for the most part, conclude that storyline. So I just found that to be kind of interesting. Later on in the article, they talk about Andromeda, and whether or not it was thought of to be like a new trilogy or not, kind of on the basis of what he had said before. And Mac Walters said, "We knew that we wanted it to be a series for sure, but not a trilogy per se. I think the idea of carrying plots and story and characters through the series and the choice and consequence was actually part of it on Andromeda, but early days Andromeda, and I wasn't on the project then." So he's kind of saying that Andromeda wasn't meant to be a solo game, and I think anyone who's played it, even in the game that actually ended up releasing, can tell. I mean, they have the whole Quarian arc, that gets left completely out there, which probably would have been a DLC, maybe not an entirely new game, but they left so many open threads in Andromeda, including that, like, we only explore like one star system in that entire game. We're so used to the idea of exploring the entire galaxy in the trilogy, and you kind of it's possible to lose sight in Andromeda that you are only exploring the tiniest part of that entire galaxy, because as far as we know, there's no system for quick travel around the galaxy, such as the Milky Way's mass relays. Getting down here, it starts talking about how they were really trying to make more from Andromeda than just being a story game. They wanted to try to mimic in some capacity No Man's Sky, and kind of do the procedurally generated content thing. But then Mac commented on that and said, ultimately, it was too much at odds with a lot of the way that we tell stories and the way that we create our content, which tends to be very bespoke, which means like kind of custom made or very handcrafted, I guess is the best translation of that word. A lot of big set pieces and things like that. It's hard to translate into a procedural world. But that was, at the start at least, that innovation that we were looking at, or what the teams were looking at. So procedural generation. I believe, and I can't, it's not on here, I don't think, but it was really interesting how they kind of acknowledge, like, and I can't remember if it's later in the article or not, but it is. So we'll talk about that in a moment. He goes on here. He talks about Walters, like many others from the original Mass Effect team, had gone to work on Anthem. So we've kind of talked about it, and it says it here. Andromeda, remember, was primarily a BioWare Montreal game, not an Edmonton one. It's important to know now that BioWare Montreal is no longer a BioWare studio and is EA Motive, which you've probably heard from some other games that they're working on and such. And then I believe it even says here that Walters was working on Anthem for a long time, and they brought him on to Andromeda fairly late, after Casey Hudson's first time leaving the company, as well as another director's name here, who Gerard Lehiani, that's my best bet. And he kind of brought in in this article, you definitely catch some, like, yeah, I know I was part of that kind of feels, but maybe that's just me. Later on in the article, it talks about Mass Effect Andromeda would eventually come out in 2017. All the difficulties with development had prevented it from reaching the heights of the previous Mass Effect games. Reviews were lukewarm to disappointed, sales were weaker than before, and in response to it, the entire Mass Effect series was put, quote, on ice. To some degree, Walters can accept that. Quote from Walters: "I don't know if people were too harsh," he says, "but they had set a very high bar with Mass Effect 3, and certainly in some key areas we did not live up to that." I would say that is to say the least. I understand there's some Andromeda lovers out there, and that's cool. There's nothing wrong with it. But I think to say they didn't live up to it in some key areas is putting it very lightly. What still bugs him about the reception is that Mass Effect 3 was a misleading yardstick, to use as comparison. As Walters mentioned earlier, by the time BioWare made Mass Effect 3, the team had incrementally honed all areas of development for making Mass Effect 1 and 2. Andromeda, by all comparison, was being made with a new team on a new engine and had a whole roster of new characters and a new story. The OK, and OK, there were some Mass Effect veterans on the team, but in reality, the whole project was closer to Mass Effect 1 and 3. And like, I understand making that point from this writer took a very friendly view to BioWare, which, as someone who tends to try to be pretty optimistic, I can appreciate. But it is interesting that they mentioned that, yeah, they had they'd incrementally honed all areas of development with the trilogy. But I guess they kind of don't just, like, I feel like it would have been good throughout there, like, and they seem to just throw that all out with Andromeda. I understand that they're pointing out that, all of that experience was gained by people who weren't even working on Andromeda, but at some point, it does seem like all the lessons learned from the trilogy basically got forgotten, and especially when Andromeda felt so much like they were just trying to kind of remake Mass Effect 1, or at least recapture that feeling. It's weird that they tried to recapture that feeling and completely ignored all the lessons learned as the result of the trilogy as a whole. I believe this is a quote from Walters, and he says, "So you go back to what I was saying before when I said if you tried to put all of the content of Mass Effect 3 on the Mass Effect 1 team, it would have taken us 10 years. Walter says, similarly, there were just a lot of things that we had to relearn, refigure out, and ultimately, when you do that, it's very, very challenging to come out and be as polished as your third iteration was, and we didn't hit that. And we probably should have, in hindsight, just reduced the scope more and executed on what we could to ensure quality." I think that is such a big point, and I think that's a big one that even goes forward to the conversation about the next game, and that, they just tried to do, they knew they couldn't recreate everything from the trilogy in one game with Andromeda, but still tried to, is what I take from that. So I think it's kind of interesting. Mac Walters went on to say, quote, "But we were also in a weird phase of the industry where a lot of people were saying quantity was quality. So we were deluding ourselves internally a bit that if it's maybe not as polished as Mass Effect 3, it's fine. It's bigger and there's more here and there's more to do. And we hit a point where people were like, no, it's okay, or at least it isn't okay for your franchise. And that's fine. That's a lesson learned." That makes me really excited because I've talked a lot about how I hope Andromeda was a lesson to the BioWare team and won't be so much an inspiration. And maybe it will be an inspiration. I don't know. But hearing it from Walters, who has left, I suspect that that sentiment is probably within everyone at that studio. And I really hope that this is true, that they realize that it wasn't okay to let the quality lack because you had plenty of quantity. And I really hope that that's a lesson learned is true. It continues on. "I only wish we'd been able to do a second one, because then you would have really seen the polish like we did from Mass Effect 1 to 2 on the original trilogy." That's a pretty common point that you even see fans make, that, well, if Andromeda had another game, then choices you made would have mattered, and this and that and the other. And that's fine. That's probably true. But again, one of the things they should have learned, in my opinion, from the trilogy, even if a lot of these people didn't work on it with Andromeda, that did work on Andromeda, is they still should have learned that because this game isn't being planned to be a trilogy, because maybe it wasn't even guaranteed to have a sequel, that you maybe wanted to have some of those consequential choices within the one game. And instead, there's a few extremely minor consequential choices you get to make in Andromeda, with the Krogan Solarian thing, and then there's a warlord and another person that you get basically to choose who lives. There's a few choices like that through the game, but they're basically inconsequential. They don't make any huge difference at the end of the day. And while I understand what they're saying here is that maybe it would have mattered in the second game, it's probably not going to happen, or at least it won't happen in a traditional true sequel sense, from what I can tell. They go on and talk more about Andromeda, and this also starts to get into the next game. Andromeda was a low point for BioWare at the time and a perceived setback in terms of quality. Anthem was a game that struggled to find its own identity and an audience, so 2 years later, EA and BioWare effectively gave up on it. If you don't remember the whole Anthem saga, is that it came out, it was rough, they didn't put out new content for a long time, if ever, from what I remember. And then there was kind of this feeling of like, and they were making statements of like, okay, we're gonna buckle down, and people were expecting like Andromeda 2.0 or Anthem 2.0, where people were expecting that it was going to be like they were going to put out a big patch. It was going to be the big No Man's Sky, the big Destiny, the Division comeback patch, where it was going to have all the stuff that people wanted. And instead of that, they worked on it for a while, and then they just canceled the project. My guess, and especially as you have read more about Anthem and we've heard more about it in the years that have passed, it was probably just too big of a project. For fans of BioWare, this meant 2 high-profile disappointments in a row, 3 sort of if you count the backlash from the original ending of Mass Effect 3. I've only played Legendary Edition. I understand that I'm spoiled, that I've only ever seen the DLC or the updated version of the ending. I acknowledge that the original endings of Mass Effect 3 were pretty lackluster, but I think this attempt to dump Mass Effect 3 into the same boat as Anthem and Andromeda, as well as ignoring Inquisition, which they do here, I think is interesting. Definitely, yeah. But Mac Walters said that wasn't. They talk about it not being a nice position to be in, and Walters responded, "Oh no, we definitely felt it." He says a lot of negative feedback the studio received. The studio's shortfall, as he sees it, had been not in marrying the innovation it likes to bring to expected BioWare experiences. And then it says, quote, and in Anthem, it was even more of a dichotomy, he adds. It almost felt like 2 games in one, and neither was fully fleshed out, unfortunately. And I think that people who played Anthem can probably attest to that Anthem had a bunch of really cool features. You hear people say the same thing about Andromeda, but it just wasn't fleshed out. And the whole experiences just feel kind of maybe a little empty because of that. Okay, skipping some here. It talks about down here, it's a quote, Walters is talking, he says, and certainly had we shipped Andromeda 2, I'm 100% certain we would have improved on all the things people called out, and then also been able to learn about the innovative things we're trying to do as well. I mean, again, this is kind of, he's going back to this thing of like, well, if we just would have had another shot, and it's like, and that's fine, but what you're saying to me, the way I take it is, well, we didn't actually learn our lessons in the trilogy, so we had to relearn them with Andromeda, but this time Andromeda wasn't successful like Mass Effect was, and we didn't get a second shot. So this goes into talking about the next game, where he talks about maybe, or the article says, maybe BioWare will still get the opportunity to iterate on Andromeda with Mass Effect 5. Editors note, video makers note, bleh. But anyways, the signs are promising. Development has been moved back to BioWare HQ in Edmonton, partly because BioWare Montreal is no more, it's EA Motive, and it seems as though problematic Frostbite engine has been ditched for Unreal Engine 5. Though this hasn't been confirmed, which is true. There's even a suggestion Mass Effect 5 will pull on story threads from Andromeda, meaning these original ideas from Andromeda beginning a linked series may still be there. This link links to an article about the 2021 like Geth Head poster day. Like there are some threads that you can pull from some of the N7 day and the teases they've done for the next game that may suggest an Andromeda connection. That one was the least of it. That one has, in my opinion, zero connection to, and I read that article and they really didn't make an argument that made sense for trying to connect, but whatever. I definitely don't think the next game is Andromeda 2, but that's just my take. This is the last and what I think is an interesting part of the article here, and I'll kind of wrap it up with that. Walter was involved in the vision for the Mass Effect, which I believe they're speaking about the next one. Quote, yeah, again, it was more of a consulting thing, as obviously, as you said, the Mass Effect guy, I was there with Casey Hudson, and we were talking about where that would go along with Mike Gamble. And then once the Legendary Edition kicked off, we got that greenlit. It was like, all right, everyone, I'm going to go do this. Good luck. I'm here if you need me, but I'm going to focus on this. So this actually supports something I've been talking about a lot. You've heard me speculate quite a bit if you've checked out my other videos, in that what I think they're saying here is that this is referencing a time when Casey Hudson came back to BioWare, I believe in 2000, I think it was 18. And he, Mac Walters, and Mike Gamble were all working on the concept for the next game, the one that's coming. But then the Legendary Edition got greenlit, and Mac Walters basically bounced off to focus on that 100%, while Casey Hudson and Gamble focused on the next game. This kind of plays into the theory I've had that Casey Hudson, when he came back to BioWare for that short time, I suspect he knew, and BioWare knew, he was setting the Humanoid Studio into stone, but it wasn't going to be ready for a while. And my guess is they basically said, hey, while you're working on that, come back, help us out with the next Mass Effect, maybe Dragon Age as well, just to set some things, maybe set the future, the overview of what we could do. And then you can go do your thing when you're ready. And I think that's what happened. And I really honestly believe that this little quote here kind of supports that. So, and then here at the end, it says, but BioWare today is different than BioWare that created the original Mass Effect, even the BioWare that made Andromeda. Walters, like Casey Hudson, is no longer there, and nor are the significant number of people who shaped the company once upon a time. Walters himself left at the end of 2022 after spending a brief period on the Dragon Age team on the new game, Dreadwolf, albeit in a production management capacity rather than creative. And then it goes on, he talks about what he wants to do next, and I'm not super worried about that. So, you know, this kind of long explanation and kind of chat, I think what's interesting about it is that it gives me some hope that that someone, even though they've left now, I suspect has a similar viewpoint as a lot of the people who still work there. You know, that they had admirable goals with Andromeda, but it just didn't work out. And you know, that they've learned their lessons from Andromeda. It's really interesting because if you want my honest take, the way that he speaks about Andromeda and the lack of there being another one, the way he words a lot of the things when they talk about that certainly doesn't make it seem to me like the next game is Andromeda, like, or that it's even going to be heavily focused on Andromeda, because you would think that he wouldn't be so wistful of wishing that they had more chances to work on Andromeda or to iterate. But maybe that's just, maybe he's, either speaking intelligently, knowing how to not give things away, or maybe there's something to that. I have no idea. But that little bit at the end, kind of confirming what I've assumed, and I'm sure lots of other people have speculated that as well, that when Casey Hudson did come back for a couple of years, that it was probably to help them kind of set the future of especially Mass Effect. I'm sure Casey Hudson cares about Dragon Age, but it seems like Mass Effect is his baby, and my guess is that him and Mike Gamble probably spent 2 years beginning the pre-production process and deciding on where that series should go. So I'll be really curious to see how that goes. I think this was an interesting article, and it feels like Walters is kind of doing his final parade as a former BioWare guy, probably before we find out he is somewhere else. So I'll remember to put this link down in the description if you want to read the entire article and kind of make some of your own conclusions. If you have any of your own thoughts, hit them down in the comments. I know this was kind of a long video, but I do appreciate if you've made it this far. If you like the video and you want more of this kind of thing, please subscribe to the channel, like the video if you liked it, leave a comment down below, or with your own comments, or just to say hello. You can check out my personal podcast. I have a weekly gaming podcast where I talk about news and speculation and reviews. It's called the Echo Cast. It's on all podcast providers and on this YouTube channel. And you can find me all over the internet as Bon Diesel, including on Twitter, YouTube, Twitch, and Instagram. And that's all I have for this one. So until next time.